Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. When Mr. Sesemann returned from his trip to Paris, he discovered how much his little daughter Clara was devoted to her young companion. Heidi may have caused a bit of upheaval in the household, but she is full of kindness and consideration as well. And she found another loving grandma in Clara's grandmama. What is more, Heidi learned from her that reading is a joy and a delight. But oh, how much she still longs for her grandfather and the high mountain pastures and the sound of the wind in the fir trees. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Heidi, Chapter 9. The Master Hears Strange Things. Some days after these happenings, there was great excitement in the Sesemann household. People were running upstairs and down, for the master of the house had just returned from his journey. Sebastian and Tinette were carrying in one bundle after another from the well-filled carriage, for Mr. Sesemann always brought a host of pretty things home with him. First of all, he went to his daughter's room to greet her. Heidi was sitting with Clara, for this was the late afternoon hour when they were always together. Clara welcomed her father with great happiness, for she loved him dearly, and the good papa greeted his little daughter no less fondly. Then he offered his hand to Heidi, who had quietly retired to a corner, and said, "And here is our little Swiss girl. Come, give me your hand, that's the way. Now tell me one thing, are you and Clara good friends? You don't quarrel and get cross and then cry and make up and then begin all over again, do you?" "No, Clara is always good to me," Heidi answered. "And Heidi hasn't even tried once to quarrel, Papa," Clara added quickly. "That's good. I'm glad to hear it," her father said, getting up from his chair. "But now you must let me get a bite to eat, Clara dear, for I haven't had a thing all day. I'll come back to you afterward and show you what I've brought for you." Mr. Sesemann went into the dining room, where Miss Rottenmeier was looking over the table, which was laid for his luncheon. When he had sat down and the lady, a living image of bad tidings, had taken her place across from him, the master of the house turned to her and said, "But, my dear Miss Rottenmeier, what am I to think? You have put on a truly alarming look to welcome me with. What can be the matter? Clara seems in the best of health." "Mr. Sesemann," the housekeeper began very seriously, "Clara is suffering too. We have been dreadfully cheated." "In what way?" Mr. Sesemann asked, quietly taking a sip of wine. "Why, we had decided, as you know, to have a playmate in the house for Clara. And as I realized how set you were on having only pure and good people about your daughter, I decided on a young Swiss girl. And I fully expected to see a creature as I have read about in books. A girl, you know, born in the fresh mountain air, one who walks through life scarcely touching the ground beneath her feet. Still, I suppose," Mr. Sesemann could not help saying, "even Swiss children touch the ground as they walk along, or they'd have wings instead of feet." "Oh, you know what I mean, sir," Miss Rottenmeier continued, "one of those beings who hear so much about, who live in the pure air of the highlands, and who sweep by us like a breath from another world." "But what would Clara do with this breath from another world?" "Please, Mr. Sesemann, it's not a thing to joke about. The matter is more serious to me than you imagine. I have been terribly, really terribly imposed upon." "But what is so terrible after all? The child does not look so bad to me," Mr. Sesemann said quietly. "There's just one thing I simply must tell you, sir. You've no idea the sort of people and animals this child has filled your house with while you were away. I'll leave that for Herr Kandidat to tell you." "With animals? Why, what do you mean by that?" "It can't be explained, that's all. None of the acts of this girl can be explained unless you believe that she has spells when she's not in her right mind." Until this moment, Mr. Sesemann had not paid much attention to the housekeeper's words. But if Heidi was not in her right mind, that was another matter. That might be very serious for his daughter. He looked quite closely at Miss Rottenmeier to make sure that she herself was entirely sane. The door was open just then, and the teacher appeared. "Ah, here comes our Herr Kandidat to tell us all about it," Mr. Sesemann greeted the new arrival. "Come in, won't you, and sit down by me." And he stretched out a hand of welcome. "Herr Kandidat will drink a cup of black coffee with me, Miss Rottenmeier. Sit down, sir, and make yourself quite at home. And now tell me, please, what is wrong with the child who has come to be my daughter's companion and your pupil? What is all this I hear about animals being brought into the house? And what sort of a mind has she?" The teacher could never give a direct answer to a simple question. First, he had to tell Mr. Sesemann how glad he was to see him safe back again, and to say that he had come especially to bid him welcome. But Mr. Sesemann urged him to stick to the point, and therefore Heidi's teacher began. "In telling you, sir, what I think of the character of this young girl, I shall have to say, first of all especially, that even if on the one hand she shows that her education is fairly weak—" Mr. Sesemann shook his head in mild despair. "A lack of mental growth caused perhaps by the fact that her teaching was begun somewhat late, or perhaps it is better to say caused by the more or less quiet life which she led while dwelling up in the Alps." "Who is crazy now?" thought Mr. Sesemann. "A quiet life, sir, which can, however, not be entirely thought of as bad, but which, on the contrary, has without doubt in certain ways many good points. And if such a life is not carried on too long, it may even be said—" "But, my dear fellow," Mr. Sesemann at last interrupted him, "you are really taking too much trouble. Just tell me this. Has the child frightened you by bringing animals into the house? And do you think her society good for my small daughter?" "Far be it from me to hurt the little girl," the instructor began again, "for although on the one hand she shows that she does not know much about society, a lack of knowledge doubtless due to the more or less simple life that the young thing led up to the moment that she was brought to Frankfurt. Excuse me, Herr Kandidat, which new fact made a great change in the growth of this only half-grown and at least not yet fully developed creature, and yet, to be sure, on the other hand, one must not deny the decided talents of the child who, if she is rightly led— Excuse me, Herr Kandidat, please, but I do not wish to disturb you further. I must pay a short visit to my daughter at once." The master of the house fairly ran out of the room and did not return. Across the hall in the library, he sat down beside Clara. Heidi had got up to give him her chair, and he turned to her and said, "Listen, little one, run and get me— Wait a minute, let me see. Run and get me—" Mr. Sesemann really couldn't think of anything he wanted, and yet Heidi must be sent away, if only for a minute. "Oh, yes, run and get me a glass of water, won't you?" "Cold water?" Heidi asked. "Oh, yes, indeed, as cold as you can get it." Heidi vanished. "And now, dear little Clara," Papa said, drawing his chair up close to hers and taking her hand in his, "tell me straight as a string what sort of animals your little playmate has brought into our house, and tell me, too, why Miss Rottenmeier should think that sometimes she is not quite right in her head." It was easy for Clara to do this, for the frightened housekeeper had spoken to her of Heidi's odd sayings, all of which, however, made good sense to Clara. First, she told her father the story of the little organ-grinder's turtle, and the kittens, and then she went on to explain the odd sayings which had so puzzled Miss Rottenmeier. This made Mr. Sesemann laugh right heartily. "Oh, then you don't want me to send the youngster home? You're not tired of her?" he asked. "Oh, my, no," Clara begged him. "Don't do that, Papa. Why, since Heidi's come, there's something happening every day, and it's such good fun. Not at all the way it was before, when nothing ever happened, and Heidi tells me such lots of things." "All right, Clara dear. Oh, and there's your little friend, back again so soon. Well, did you get me fine cold water?" Mr. Sesemann asked, as Heidi offered him a glass. "Right, fresh from the well," Heidi answered. "Surely you didn't go to the well yourself for it," said Clara. "Of course I did, and it's fresh as anything, only I had to go so far for it because there were so many people at the first well. Then I went down the street, but there were just as many waiting their turn at the second one. And then I went to another street, and there I got the water, and the gentleman with the white hair wants to be remembered to Mr. Sesemann." "Well, that was a quick trip," laughed the master of the house. "And who may the old gentleman be?" "He was passing the well, but he stopped and said, 'As you've a glass with you, why not give me a drink too? For whom are you getting the water?' 'For Mr. Sesemann,' I said. And then he laughed right out and sent you his greetings, and said he hoped you would like the water." "You don't say. I wonder who wanted to be remembered to me. How did the gentleman look?" "He has a nice big laugh, and a thick gold chain, and a gold thing with a big red stone hangs on it, and there's a horse's head on his stick." "That is the doctor!" "That's my old doctor!" both Clara and her father said in the same breath. Mr. Sesemann could not help laughing in secret when he thought how surprised his friend would be at this new way of getting one's water brought in. That same evening, when he was sitting in the dining room, talking over all sorts of household matters with Miss Rottenmeier, Mr. Sesemann told her his daughter's companion was to remain in the house. He thought the child was healthy in every way, and his daughter was very fond of her society, and liked it better than any other. "And so I wish," Mr. Sesemann added, "to have this child always treated kindly. Don't think of her oddities as sins. Besides, Miss Rottenmeier, if you cannot get along with the child, there is every hope of your having good help in the near future. My mother is coming up to pay us a long visit, and you remember that she can manage anyone, no matter how odd he may be. Do you not?" "Oh, yes, I know that well enough," the lady replied. But somehow her face did not look cheerful at this promise of help. Mr. Sesemann could take at this time only a short vacation, and after 2 weeks or so, his business again called him to Paris. And when Clara insisted that she just couldn't let him go away so soon, he comforted her by promising that grandmama would soon arrive, and was expected a few days later. And Mr. Sesemann had scarcely departed when a letter came to say that Mrs. Sesemann had already left Holstein, where she lived on an old estate. The letter gave the exact hour of her arrival on the next day, so that the carriage could be sent to the depot for her. Clara was overjoyed at this news, and that evening she talked so much and so long about her grandmama that Heidi too began to call her grandmama. This action of Heidi's brought a sour look from Miss Rottenmeier, but the child paid no heed to it, for by this time she had grown used to receiving such glances, and took them as a matter of course. But once Heidi was started on her way to bed, the housekeeper called her into her room and told her quite clearly that she must never use the name grandmama. When Mrs. Sesemann came, Heidi must address her as gracious lady. "You understand, do you?" Miss Rottenmeier asked, as Heidi looked at her in a funny way, but she gave the child such a cross look that Heidi did not dare ask questions, although she did not understand what the title meant. Chapter 10. a grandma. Next evening, there were great preparations going on in the Sesemann household. In fact, there was such a to-do that it was plain the lady they were waiting for played a very important part in their thoughts. You could see that she was both loved and feared by all. Tinette had put a brand-new lace cap on her head. Sebastian had scraped together a lot of footstools and put them in all possible places, so the great lady could find one right under her feet, no matter where she might sit down to rest. Miss Rottenmeier, very stiff and straight, walked through the rooms examining everything, as if to show that her own rule was by no means at an end, even if a second lady of the house was coming. And then the carriage rolled up before the house, and Sebastian and Tinette went flying down the steps. Slowly and with dignity, the housekeeper followed them, for she knew she must also be present to welcome Mrs. Sesemann. Heidi had been ordered to stay in her room and to wait there until she was sent for, because grandmama would first go to see Clara, and of course would want to be alone with her for a while. So Heidi sat down in a corner and said over the words she was to use to the new arrival. But it was hardly any time at all before Tinette thrust the tip of her nose in at the door and said snippily, just as always, "Off with you to the library." Heidi had been unable to ask Miss Rottenmeier again about the strange words she was to use with grandmama. She thought perhaps the housekeeper had made a mistake, since always before she had heard people spoken of as Mr. or Mrs., and their real names afterward. So she settled the matter to her own satisfaction. When she opened the library door, grandmama called out to her in a cheery voice, "Ah, there's the child. Come over here to me, and let's have a good look at you." Heidi did as she was told, and in her clear voice she said quite distinctly, "Good day, Mrs. Gracious." "Mrs. Gracious? Frau Gnädige?" laughed grandmama. "Oh, me, oh my! Is that what they say where you come from? Is that what you've heard at home in the Alps?" "Oh, no. Nobody has such a name in my house," Heidi answered seriously. "Well, there's no such person here either," grandmama said with another laugh, as she patted Heidi's cheek affectionately. "But don't you mind. In the nursery I am just grandmama, and you can remember to call me that, can't you?" "Surely I can," Heidi assured the nice lady. "That's what I always called you before." "That's as it should be," grandmama said, nodding her head and smiling. Then she looked at Heidi very closely, and from time to time she would nod her head again, and Heidi kept looking steadily into her eyes, for they were so kind. They made the child very happy. All of grandmama, in fact, pleased her so much that she simply had to stand and stare at her. She had such pretty white hair, and wore a lovely lace frill around her head, and 2 broad ribbons fluttered away from the cap and kept moving here and there, as if a gentle breeze was always blowing around grandmama, and Heidi thought that specially charming. "And what's your name, dear?" grandmama suddenly asked. "My real name's only Heidi, but because I'm to be called Adelheid, I always answer if—" And right there, Heidi suddenly stuck and felt a little guilty, for she remembered that she did not always answer when Miss Rottenmeier unexpectedly called her Adelheid. You see, she couldn't quite feel that this was her name, and here was Miss Rottenmeier coming into the room at this very minute. "Mrs. Sesemann, I am sure, will justify me in choosing a name which can at least be spoken without one's feeling ashamed, even if just before the servants." "My dear Rottenmeier," replied Mrs. Sesemann, "if a human being goes and gets called Heidi and answers to that name, then that's what I'll call her. That's all there is to it." It was very annoying to Miss Rottenmeier to have the old lady constantly address her by her name simply, without putting Miss before it. But there was no help for it. Grandmama had her own way of doing things, and stuck to it, no matter how one might feel about it. What was more, the old lady had all her 5 senses, and knew what was going on in a house the minute she stepped inside of it. On the day after her arrival, when Clara, as usual, was lying down after dinner, Grandmama sat down beside her in an armchair and closed her eyes for a few minutes. Soon, however, she got up again, for after 40 winks she was as wide awake as ever, and walked out into the dining room. It was empty. "Clara is fast asleep," she said to herself. So she went to the room of Lady Rottenmeier and pounded loudly on the door. After some little delay, the housekeeper answered to the knocking, only to start back in much amazement at this unexpected visit. "Where does the child keep herself at this hour, and what is she up to, I'd like to know?" Mrs. Sesemann said. "She is sitting in her room where she might find something useful for her 2 hands to do, if she had the least desire for such work. But, Mrs. Sesemann, you really ought to know what silly acts the creature plans at such times, and often goes ahead and does them. Things really that one can scarcely speak of in good society. Just what I should do myself if I had to sit bottled up the way this child does. Oh, I'm quite sure I should. And then you would see how much of my silliness could be mentioned in polite society. Go get the child and bring her into my room. I'm going to give her some pretty books I bought for her." "But that's just what you can't do. You'll see," cried Miss Rottenmeier, holding up her hands in horror. "What can the child do with books, Mrs. Sesemann? In all this time she has not even learned her ABCs. You really can't get a single idea into that creature's head. You ask Herr Kandidat, if you can. If that good fellow did not have the patience of the heavenly angels themselves, he would have given up trying to teach her anything long ago." "Indeed, that's very strange. The child does not look to me like one that cannot learn her ABCs," Mrs. Sesemann said. "Bring her to me anyway. She can at least look at the pictures in the books." Miss Rottenmeier had it in mind to say something more, but Mrs. Sesemann had already turned away and was hurrying to her room. She was very much surprised at what she heard about Heidi's stupidity. She thought she would look into the matter without saying anything to the teacher, because she did not particularly care for him, because of his very calculated good manners. She was glad to speak to him in a very kindly way whenever they met, but she always got away from him as soon as she could, and kept from having a long talk with him, because his manner of saying things was very wearying to her. So shortly after Heidi went to her room, Fräulein Rottenmeier appeared to call her. She went into Grandmama's room and opened her eyes wide when she saw the splendidly colored pictures in the books the old lady had brought her. But all at once the child screamed loudly, after Grandmama had turned over a new page. With glowing eyes, she looked at the figures in the picture, and then her eyes filled with hot tears and she began to sob. Grandmama looked closely at the picture. It showed a pretty green meadow where all sorts of animals were grazing and feeding on young shrubs. In the middle stood a shepherd, who was leaning on his long staff and gazing at the happy creatures. A golden light rested on the whole scene, for the sun was just sinking below the horizon. The old lady took Heidi's hand in hers. "Come, come, my dear," she said in the nicest way. "You really mustn't cry so. I suppose the picture made you think of something, but see here, there's a really pretty story about it, and I'll tell it to you this evening. And there are lots of other lovely stories in the book, too. We'll read them and tell them to each other later. And now we must have a little talk together. So wipe away your tears and stand right before me where I can see you clearly. That's good. Now we're happy again." But it was still some time before Heidi could quite stop sobbing. Grandmama waited a few moments for her to recover, saying now and then to encourage the child, "There, everything is all right. and we're just as happy as we ever were." When at last she saw that Heidi was comforted, she said, "Now, my dear, there's something I want to know. How are you getting along in your lessons with Herr Kandidat? Have you learned a good deal, and do you understand things?" "Oh, no," Heidi said with a sigh, "but I knew from the start that you couldn't learn it." "What do you mean, Heidi, by saying that you knew the lessons couldn't be learned?" "Children can't learn to read. It's too hard for them." "Why, what a notion! And where did you learn this strange fact?" "Peter told me so, and I guess he knows, for he always has to keep trying it, and he never can get it. It's too hard." "Well, Peter must be a strange lad, I must say. But look here, Heidi, you mustn't believe everything that Peter tells you. You must just try for yourself. Surely you can't have put your whole mind on what your teacher was saying and looked carefully at his letters." "That doesn't do any good," Heidi said in the voice of one who gives in to fate. "Let me tell you something," said Grandmama. "You have not learned to read, Heidi, just because you believed what Peter said. Suppose you now believe what I tell you. Really and truly, you can learn to read in almost no time, just as lots of other children who are like you and not like Peter." "Oh, goody!" "And then just think of what will happen when you can read. You saw the shepherd standing in the pretty green meadow? Well, the minute you can read, this book will be your very own, and then you can learn everything about him, just as if someone told you his story. You'll know all that he is doing with his sheep and his goats, and the strange things that happen to him. You would like that, wouldn't you, Heidi?" The child had listened to Grandmama with the closest attention. Then she drew a deep breath and said with shining eyes, "I wish I could read this minute." "It will come to you, and I can see that it will not be long now, Heidi. But we must go and see what Clara is doing. Come, we will take the pretty books along." Grandmama took Heidi's hand in hers and went with her to the study. There was a day, you remember, when Heidi had wanted to go home. That was the day when Miss Rottenmeier scolded her so terribly out on the front steps, and told her how naughty and how bad she was to wish to run away, and what a good thing it was that Mr. Sesemann didn't know about it. Well, from that time a change had taken place in Heidi. She had been made to understand that she could not go home whenever she felt like it, as Aunt Dee had promised her, but that she must stay in Frankfurt for ever and ever so long, perhaps for always. She had also been made to think that when Mr. Sesemann came home, he would find her very naughty for wanting to leave, and Heidi supposed that Grandmama and Clara would feel the same way about it. So Heidi could tell no one that she was homesick, because Grandmama had been so good to her that she could not bear to make her cross the way she had made Miss Rottenmeier. So it was that Heidi's heart grew heavier with each new day. She lost her appetite for food. She kept growing more wan and white. She often lay awake at night for hours, because the moment that she was by herself, and all had grown still around her, she began to see living pictures of the mountain pasture and the sunlight on it and the flowers. And when she did finally go to sleep, there would come to her in her dreams the ruddy, sharp rocks of Falkness, or the gleaming snowfields of Casaplana. At such times she would awake in the early morning, prepared to dash joyfully out of the hut, only to discover that she was in her big bed in Frankfurt, so far away from her Swiss mountains, and she could not go home. Then Heidi would often bury her face in the pillow and cry for a long time, but so gently that nobody heard her. The child's grief did not escape Grandmama's sharp eyes. The old lady waited for several days to see if a change for the better would come, and Heidi would lose her sadness. But as Heidi's mood continued to be the same, and grandmama often noticed early in the morning that Heidi had been weeping, she finally took the child to her room one day, looked at her very kindly, and said, "Tell me what's the matter, dear. Have you some trouble?" Heidi was afraid of seeming naughty to this nice grandmama and of making her less friendly, so she answered, "There's just nothing to say." "There isn't? Could you tell Clara about it, I wonder?" asked grandmama. "Oh, no, not a living soul," Heidi said quickly, and then she looked so unhappy that the old lady's heart was filled with pity. "Listen, dear," she said, "I'll tell you something. When we have a sorrow that we can't share with anyone, we tell it to the dear God in heaven, and we ask Him to help us, for He can take away every thought that makes us sad. You know that, Heidi, don't you? Don't you pray every night to the dear God in heaven and thank Him for all your blessings and beg Him to keep you from harm?" "Oh, no, I never do that," the child answered. "Have you never said a prayer, dear? Don't you know how to pray?" "I used to pray a little with the first grandmother, but that is so long ago I've forgotten all about it." "See, dear, that's what makes you so sad, because you don't know anyone who can help you. Just think of how good it feels when your heart is sad and heavy, to know you can go at any moment to dear God and tell Him your trouble, and ask Him to help you when no one else can. And He can always help us and give us things to make us happy again." A look of joy flashed into Heidi's eyes. "Can you tell Him everything? Just everything?" "There is nothing we cannot tell Him, Heidi." The child drew her hand away from grandmama and said quickly, "Can I go now, please?" "Of course you can," the old lady answered. Heidi ran off to her room, sat down on a footstool, folded her little hands, and told the dear God everything that was in her heart to make it heavy, and she asked Him to help her and to let her go home to her grandfather. A little more than a week may have passed since this first day of prayer, when the teacher asked to see Mrs. Sesemann, as he had something important to say to her. He was asked to come to her room, and the moment he entered, Mrs. Sesemann offered him her hand and said, "I bid you welcome, my dear Herr Kandidat. Sit down by me, please, and tell me your message. It is nothing unpleasant, I hope." She pushed a chair toward her visitor. "Quite the opposite, dear lady," the instructor began. "Do you know, the strangest thing has happened, a thing that nobody could possibly have seen in anything that went before it. For from all I could tell, what has just occurred appears to be absolutely impossible, and yet it has happened in the strangest way, although it is exactly opposite to anything I had a right to expect." "You don't mean to say the child has learned to read, Herr Kandidat?" broke in Mrs. Sesemann. The man stared at the old lady, greatly astonished that she had guessed his errand. "Oh, it is very strange indeed," he said after a while. "Not only that the little girl did not learn her ABCs in spite of my clear explanations and the trouble I took with her, but also that now in no time at all, after I had decided to give up what could not be done, and without explaining them at all thoroughly to present to the eyes of the young girl the naked letters themselves, so to speak." "She suddenly began to understand?" Grandmama asked. "Why, yes, she learned to read overnight, you might say, and at once began to read with a correctness which I have found in few beginners. But a fact that is almost as strange to me, dear lady, is that you knew straight off the truth of my most queer message." "Many wonderful things happen in this life of ours," Mrs. Sesemann said with a pleased smile. "Two different things sometimes occur at the same time, such as a new interest in studying and a new way of teaching, and neither of these can do any harm, Herr Kandidat. Let's just be happy that the child has got along so well, and hope for further progress." She walked to the door with her visitor, and then went quickly to the library, in order to make sure with her own eyes that the good news was true. Sure enough, Heidi was sitting beside Clara and reading a story to her, and you could see the great surprise and the growing excitement with which she was looking into the new world that was opening up to her, now that at last people and facts stepped out from the black letters and became living and had stirring adventures. That very same evening as they sat down to dinner, Heidi found the big book with the pretty pictures lying on her plate. And when she looked across at grandmama with a question in her eyes, the old lady said with a nod, "Yes, dear, the book belongs to you now." "Forever and ever? To take home with me?" Heidi asked, her cheeks red with happiness. "Of course, for keeps," grandmama assured her. "Tomorrow you and I will begin to read it." "But you're not going home, Heidi. Not for many years to come," Clara said. "When grandmama goes away again this time, you'll just have to stay close by me." Heidi had to look at her book before she could ever go to sleep that night up in her room, and from that day forward, it was her dearest possession. She loved nothing better than to sit over her book and read again and again the stories that went with the bright, pretty pictures. When in the evening, grandmama would say, "Now Heidi's going to read for us," Heidi would be delighted because the book had become easy for her. The stories seemed more beautiful and real to her when she read them aloud, and grandmama made things very clear to her and told her much that was not in the book. But best of all, the child liked to sit and gaze at her green meadow and the shepherd in the midst of his flocks as he stood leaning so contentedly on his long staff, for he was happy to be with his father's fine herd and to walk with the happy sheep and goats who were his delight. But right after that followed the picture where the shepherd had run away from his father's house and was living in a strange land. He had to tend the swine, and the husks, which were all he had to eat, had made him very thin. The sun no longer shone with such a golden light in this picture, and the whole scene was gray and misty. However, happily there was another picture to this story. In it the father was shown coming from the house with outspread arms and running to welcome the returning prodigal son, who was stealing home all ragged and hungry and sorry. This was the story that Heidi loved best. She read it over and over aloud and to herself, and she never grew tired of hearing grandmama tell things about it. There were a great many other beautiful tales in the book. Reading these and looking at their pictures made the days pass by very quickly, and soon the time was at hand when grandmama had decided to end her visit. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to Heidi. I'd love to hear your suggestions for future stories, so please send an email to me at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.